February 8, 1954. The mist clung to the limestone ridges surrounding Dien Bien Phu like wet bandages, concealing the valley floor where French engineers hammered steel into defensive positions. From his concealed observation post 17 kilometers northeast of the fortress, a man known only as Bison adjusted the focus on his German-made Zeiss binoculars and counted muzzle flashes in the pre-dawn darkness. The humidity pressed against his skin like a living thing, carrying the scent of rotting vegetation and cordite from distant artillery exchanges. His radio, a modified SCR-300 backpack unit weighing 35 pounds, crackled with static as he prepared his morning transmission to Hanoi. The jungle breathed around him with the rhythm of an ancient lung, indifferent to the approaching collision of empire that would reshape the balance of Southeast Asia forever. Born James Robert Thibodeau in the Bayou country of Louisiana, the man called Bison had learned to read the language of swamps and wilderness long before the Office of Strategic Services recruited him for operations behind Japanese lines in Burma. Now, at 34, his weathered face bore the permanent tan of a man who lived between shadows, fluent in Vietnamese, Laotian, and the mountain dialects of the Hmong people who had become his unlikely allies. The GCMA, Groupement de Commandos Mixtes Aéroportés, existed in the grey spaces between regular military units and intelligence operations, a hybrid creation of French colonial desperation and American Cold War pragmatism. Each morning, Bison transmitted coordinates, troop movements, and artillery positions to French command posts scattered across Tonkin, his voice disappearing into the ether of radio waves that had become the nervous system of modern warfare. The French military establishment viewed the GCMA with the disdain reserved for necessary but distasteful instruments. In the ornate colonial buildings of Hanoi, where ceiling fans turned lazily above maps marked with colored pins, staff officers dismissed the mixed commandos as beau geste fantasies, a reference to the romantic Foreign Legion novels that bore no resemblance to the brutal mathematics of jungle warfare. Colonel Henri Navarre, the commanding general who had conceived the fortress strategy at Dien Bien Phu, tolerated the GCMA as a source of tactical intelligence but refused to integrate their reports into his strategic planning. To him, the decisive battle would be won by conventional forces arrayed in prepared positions, supported by superior firepower and French military engineering. The hybrid units operating in the mountains represented an acknowledgement of weakness, an admission that France could no longer control Indochina through the traditional methods that had built its empire. American involvement in the GCMA reflected a deeper strategic calculation that extended far beyond the immediate crisis in Vietnam. The Central Intelligence Agency, barely 7 years old and hungry to prove its relevance in the emerging Cold War, saw the mixed commandos as a laboratory for the kind of unconventional warfare that might be necessary to contain communist expansion across Southeast Asia. Officers from the CIA's Far East Division, many of them OSS veterans like Bison, understood that the techniques being refined in the Indochinese highlands, the coordination of indigenous forces, the use of radio communications to direct airstrikes, the integration of intelligence gathering with paramilitary operations, would form the foundation of American strategy in any future conflict in the region. Each transmission from the field was simultaneously a tactical report and a data point in a larger experiment in asymmetric warfare. The technological infrastructure supporting operations like Bison's represented a revolution in military communications that few commanders fully understood. The SCR-300 radio, originally developed for American infantry units in World War II, had been modified with crystal-controlled frequency synthesis that allowed operators to shift between multiple channels without physical reconfiguration of the equipment. The antenna system, improvised from copper wire and bamboo poles, could transmit voice communications across distances of 50 kilometers when atmospheric conditions permitted. More importantly, the radios could relay coded coordinates to forward air controllers flying Grumman F-8F Bearcats and Douglas B-26 Invaders, allowing precision strikes against targets that would have been impossible to locate using conventional artillery spotting techniques. The marriage of radio technology and tactical aviation had created possibilities for battlefield coordination that fundamentally altered the relationship between intelligence gathering and combat operation. The enemy understood these technological developments with a clarity that often eluded Western military leaders. Chinese advisors working with the Viet Minh had studied American communications procedures during the Korean War, developing sophisticated techniques for radio intercepts and traffic analysis that could locate transmitters through triangulation and frequency monitoring. The People's Liberation Army had established listening posts throughout the mountains of northern Vietnam, staffed with operators trained in American radio procedures and equipped with Soviet-manufactured direction-finding equipment. Every transmission from units like Bison's created an electronic signature that could be tracked, analyzed, and eventually targeted. The invisible war of radio waves had become as important as the visible movements of troops and artillery. The morning of February 10th brought low clouds and intermittent rain that turned the red clay soil into a slippery paste that clung to boots and equipment. Bison had moved his observation post twice during the previous week, following standard GCMA protocol designed to prevent enemy forces from plotting his position through radio direction finding. His current position, a limestone cave overlooking the Nam Yum River, provided excellent visibility of the mountain passes through which Viet Minh reinforcements moved under cover of darkness. The cave system extended deep into the mountainside, offering multiple escape routes and protection from artillery bombardment, but it also created challenges for radio transmission that required him to position his antenna outside the cave mouth during communications windows. At 0647 hours, Bison began his scheduled transmission to Hanoi, using the call sign Fox 2 assigned to his sector of operations. The message, encoded using a one-time pad cipher that changed daily, contained coordinates for what appeared to be a battery of heavy artillery being positioned on the eastern ridgeline overlooking Dien Bien Phu. Through his binoculars, he had counted the distinctive signatures of Soviet-manufactured 105mm howitzers being moved into revetments that showed signs of professional military engineering. The intelligence was critical, because French defensive planning assumed that Viet Minh forces lacked the heavy artillery necessary to suppress the fortress from the surrounding high ground. Control, this is Fox 2. Priority traffic follows. Bison's voice, steady and professional despite the circumstances, carried across the radio waves to a receiving station in Hanoi, where a French signals officer transcribed the encoded message for immediate relay to operational planners. The transmission lasted 43 seconds, well within the safety parameters established to prevent enemy direction finding, but long enough to convey the essential tactical information that could influence the deployment of French reserves and artillery assets. The message disappeared into the communication network that connected field operations to strategic command center, becoming part of the information flow that shaped military decision-making at every level of the hierarchy. Unknown to Bison, his transmission had been intercepted by a Chinese monitoring station located in a mountain village 12 kilometers to the northwest. The operators, using equipment provided by the Soviet Union and techniques developed through years of experience with American communications procedures, had identified his transmitter as a high-priority target for elimination. The frequency, call sign, and transmission schedule had been logged in files that tracked Western intelligence operations throughout Indochina. Within hours of his transmission, a patrol of Viet Minh regulars, accompanied by Chinese advisors, had begun moving through the jungle toward the coordinates calculated through triangulation of his radio signal. The French response to Bison's intelligence demonstrated the institutional barriers that prevented effective utilization of unconventional intelligence sources. The report reached the operations section at Dien Bien Phu 8 hours after transmission, delayed by the military bureaucracy that required all GCMA communications to be processed through regular intelligence channels. By the time French artillery officers received the coordinates for the enemy battery, the weapons had been camouflaged and prepared for operations against the fortress. A counter-battery mission launched that afternoon succeeded only in cratering empty positions, while the actual guns remained hidden in positions that had been carefully surveyed and prepared over a period of weeks. The failure to act effectively on Bison's intelligence reflected deeper problems in French military culture that extended far beyond communication delay. The colonial army that had conquered Indochina in the 19th century operated according to hierarchical principles that emphasized central control and formal procedures over the flexibility required for jungle warfare. Officers trained at Saint-Cyr and the École de Guerre understood warfare as a science governed by mathematical principles, where superior training and equipment would inevitably triumph over numerically superior but less sophisticated opponents. The concept that indigenous forces, fighting on familiar terrain with knowledge accumulated over generations, might possess tactical advantages that could offset French technological superiority, challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. Chinese involvement in the intelligence war surrounding Dien Bien Phu represented a sophisticated understanding of the role that information operations played in contemporary military conflict. The People's Liberation Army had established a comprehensive program for training Vietnamese radio operators, cryptographers, and intelligence analysts in techniques derived from their own experience fighting American-equipped nationalist forces during the Chinese Civil War. The program emphasized the systematic exploitation of enemy communications weaknesses, the development of deception operations designed to manipulate enemy decision-making, and the integration of electronic intelligence with conventional military operations. Chinese advisors understood that victory in Indochina would depend as much on controlling information flows as on the movement of troops and artillery. The night of February 13th brought the kind of tropical storm that transformed the mountains of northern Vietnam into a landscape of waterfalls and mudslides. Bison huddled in his cave, listening to rain pound against the limestone walls, while he prepared his evening transmission to Hanoi. The weather conditions that made movement treacherous for ground forces also created atmospheric effects that could disrupt radio communications or, under certain circumstances, extend transmission ranges far beyond normal parameters. The electromagnetic properties of tropical storms remained imperfectly understood by military communicators, creating unpredictable variation in the reliability and security of battle communications networks. His message that night contained information that would have fundamentally altered French tactical planning if it had been properly analyzed and disseminated. Through careful observation over the previous week, Bison had identified what appeared to be a comprehensive network of underground tunnels and bunkers being constructed in the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. The excavation work, carried out with a level of engineering sophistication that suggested professional military guidance, indicated that Viet Minh forces were preparing defensive positions designed to withstand sustained bombardment by French artillery and tactical aircraft. The implications were enormous because French strategy depended on the assumption that enemy forces would be forced to attack prepared defensive positions without adequate protection from return fire. The transmission, encoded and compressed into a burst lasting less than 60 seconds, represented months of patient observation and analysis by an operator whose understanding of jungle warfare had been refined through years of experience in the mountains of Southeast Asia. Bison had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed military activity in seemingly pristine wilderness areas, the patterns of foot traffic that indicated supply routes, the changes in vegetation that suggested excavation work, the movements of civilian populations that reflected the presence of military force. His report contained tactical intelligence that could have prompted a fundamental reassessment of French strategy, but it disappeared into communication networks that were increasingly overwhelmed by the volume of information flowing from field operators throughout Indochina. The morning of February 15th brought the kind of crystalline visibility that occurred after major storms, when the atmosphere seemed washed clean and the mountains stood out with photographic clarity. Bison used the improved visibility to conduct a comprehensive reconnaissance of the terrain between his position and the fortress, mapping artillery positions and supply routes that had been obscured by earlier weather conditions. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears about French tactical assumptions. The enemy had not simply surrounded Dien Bien Phu with conventional forces deployed in obvious positions, but had created an integrated system of mutually supporting positions that would be extremely difficult to locate and destroy through conventional bombardment. His transmission that morning represented a departure from standard GCMA communication protocols that would have consequences extending far beyond his individual mission. Instead of limiting his report to specific tactical observations, Bison attempted to convey his assessment of the overall strategic situation developing around Dien Bien Phu. The message, necessarily longer and more complex than routine intelligence reports, contained his analysis of enemy capabilities and intentions based on weeks of careful observation. He understood that the information was critical enough to justify the increased risk of detection that came with extended transmission time, but he underestimated the sophistication of enemy radio intercept capabilities that had been tracking his communications since his arrival in the area. The Chinese listening post that intercepted Bison's transmission represented a convergence of Soviet technology and Chinese tactical innovation that reflected the communist commitment to supporting the Viet Minh campaign in Indochina. The monitoring station, established in a village that appeared to be engaged in subsistence agriculture, contained radio equipment that could intercept and analyze communications across a broad spectrum of frequencies used by Western military forces. The operators, trained in technical schools in China, and equipped with detailed knowledge of American and French communication procedures, could not only locate enemy transmitters, but also analyze the content of intercepted messages to develop intelligence about enemy capabilities and intention. The analysis of Bison's intercepted transmissions revealed patterns that Chinese intelligence officers found deeply troubling from their perspective. The quality of tactical intelligence being reported suggested that Western forces possessed observation capabilities that could significantly complicate Viet Minh operations around Dien Bien Phu. The consistency of the reports indicated that the transmitter represented a permanent observation post rather than temporary reconnaissance patrols that might be avoided through careful movement technique. Most concerning from the Chinese perspective was the evidence that Western intelligence operators had achieved a level of integration with local populations that provided access to information about communist military activities that should have remained secret. The decision to eliminate Bison's observation reflected calculations that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation around Dien Bien Phu. Chinese advisors understood that the intelligence techniques being tested in Indochina would likely be employed by Western forces in any future conflict in Southeast Asia. The ability to establish long-term observation posts staffed by operators with cultural knowledge and language capabilities represented a significant threat to communist operations throughout the region. By demonstrating that such positions could be identified and eliminated through systematic intelligence work, the Chinese hoped to discourage similar operations in the future and preserve the intelligence advantages that came from operating in familiar terrain with popular support. The patrol dispatched to locate and eliminate Bison's position consisted of 12 Viet Minh regulars under the command of a Chinese advisor with experience in intelligence operations during the Korean War. The force moved through the jungle using techniques designed to avoid detection by Western surveillance methods, traveling during periods of reduced visibility and following routes that minimized exposure to aerial observation. Each member of the patrol had been selected for specific skills that would be necessary for the successful completion of their mission, tracking abilities that could follow subtle signs of human activity through difficult terrain, technical knowledge of radio equipment that would allow them to confirm the elimination of the target transmitter, and interrogation techniques that might extract information about other Western intelligence operations in the area. The approach to Bison's Cave required 3 days of careful movement through terrain that challenged even experienced jungle fighters. The limestone mountains of northern Vietnam contained cave systems that could conceal defensive positions while providing observation points that were extremely difficult to approach without detection. The patrol used a combination of direct reconnaissance and intelligence gathered from local populations to develop an understanding of the target area that would allow them to coordinate their assault with maximum effectiveness. The operation represented the kind of small unit action that required careful planning and precise execution to succeed against a well-prepared defensive position. February 18th dawned with the deceptive calm that often preceded major military actions in the mountains of Indochina. Bison completed his morning transmission to Hanoi at 07:15 hours, unaware that his radio signal was being monitored by direction-finding equipment that had calculated his position with sufficient accuracy to guide a direct assault. The message contained routine intelligence about enemy supply movements observed during the previous night, but it also included a request for extraction that indicated his growing awareness of the deteriorating security situation around his observation post. The request, buried in coded language within the operational report, suggested that even experienced operators were beginning to recognize the increased sophistication of enemy counterintelligence operations. The assault on Bison's position began at 14:30 hours with a coordinated attack that demonstrated the tactical proficiency that Viet Minh forces had developed through years of combat against French colonial forces. The initial phase involved the systematic elimination of escape routes from the cave system, achieved through the positioning of small teams at locations that dominated the approaches to alternative positions. The technique reflected an understanding of defensive psychology that came from extensive experience with Western military doctrine, where isolated units typically maintained multiple prepared positions that could be occupied if primary locations were compromised. The actual assault on the cave utilized a combination of explosives and small arms fire that overwhelmed Bison's defensive preparations within minutes. The limestone walls that provided protection against artillery bombardment offered no protection against concentrated small arms fire delivered from positions that had been carefully selected to create overlapping fields of fire. Bison's return fire accurate and disciplined despite the circumstances, succeeded in inflicting casualties on the attacking force, but could not prevent the systematic destruction of his radio equipment and the elimination of his ability to communicate with friendly forces. The capture of Bison represented a significant intelligence opportunity for Chinese and Viet Minh forces that extended far beyond the immediate tactical benefits of eliminating a Western observation post. As an experienced intelligence operator with detailed knowledge of American and French communication procedures, he possessed information that could significantly enhance Communist understanding of Western intelligence operations throughout Southeast Asia. The interrogation techniques that would be employed reflected methods developed through extensive experience with captured American personnel during the Korean War, refined through psychological research conducted in Chinese military institutions. The initial phase of Bison's interrogation took place in a temporary facility established in a cave system approximately 8 kilometers from his original position. The location, selected for its security advantages and proximity to communication links with higher headquarters, contained the technical equipment necessary to analyze captured radio equipment and documentation. Chinese intelligence officers, working with Vietnamese counterparts who possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions, conducted the interrogation according to systematic procedures designed to extract maximum information while maintaining the subject's physical and psychological condition over an extended period. The interrogation revealed information that confirmed Chinese intelligence assessments about the scope and sophistication of Western intelligence operation into China. Bison's knowledge of GCMA organization, communication procedures, and operational methods provided insights into American and French intelligence cooperation that had been difficult to assess through other collection methods. More importantly, his understanding of broader strategic objectives indicated that Western intelligence operations represented preparation for more extensive American involvement in Southeast Asian conflicts that might extend far beyond the immediate crisis in Vietnam. The psychological pressure applied during Bison's interrogation reflected techniques that had been developed through extensive study of American military culture and individual psychology. Chinese interrogators understood that Western personnel responded to different incentives and pressures than Asian subjects, requiring modified approaches that took into account cultural background, professional training, and individual personality characteristics. The systematic application of physical and psychological pressure, combined with sophisticated exploitation of captured equipment and documentation, represented a level of professional competence that reflected years of experience and institutional learning. The decision to utilize Bison's radio equipment for deception operations marked a turning point in the intelligence war surrounding Dien Bien Phu that would have consequences extending far beyond his individual capture. Chinese and Vietnamese intelligence officers understood that the systematic transmission of false information through compromised communication channels could manipulate French military decision-making in ways that would provide significant tactical advantages to Communist forces. The deception operation required careful planning and technical expertise to ensure that false transmissions would be accepted as legitimate intelligence by French communication networks. The technical aspects of the deception operation demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of Western communication procedures that Chinese intelligence services had developed through years of systematic study. The captured SCR-300 radio was modified with additional equipment that allowed operators to mimic the transmission characteristics and operating procedures that French communication specialists would expect from legitimate GCMA stations. The encoding procedures, extracted through interrogation and analysis of captured materials, provided the capability to transmit false intelligence reports that would appear authentic to French analysts who lacked independent verification methods. The first false transmission using Bison's compromised radio equipment was sent on February 22nd, 4 days after his capture. The message, carefully constructed to provide tactical intelligence that would misdirect French artillery and air operations, reported enemy troop movements in locations that had been abandoned by Viet Minh forces. The information was sufficiently plausible to pass initial analysis by French intelligence officers, but sufficiently inaccurate to waste significant military resources on targets that no longer represented genuine threats. The psychological effect on French commanders was as important as the tactical benefit, as the systematic degradation of intelligence reliability undermined confidence in GCMA reporting throughout the theater of operation. The success of the initial deception transmission encouraged Chinese intelligence officers to expand the operation into a systematic campaign designed to manipulate French tactical decision-making throughout the remainder of the Dien Bien Phu campaign. Subsequent false reports provided information about enemy capabilities and intentions that consistently understated Viet Minh's strength, while misdirecting French attention towards secondary objectives that diverted resources from critical defensive requirements. The operation represented a sophisticated understanding of the role that intelligence played in modern military operations, demonstrating that control of information flows could be as important as conventional military capabilities in determining the outcome of major battles. The French response to the degradation of GCMA intelligence demonstrated institutional weaknesses in Western military organizations that had been identified and exploited by communist intelligence services throughout the Cold War period. French intelligence officers, trained in analytical methods that emphasized technical verification and cross-correlation of multiple sources, found themselves increasingly dependent on human intelligence sources that were vulnerable to compromise and deception. The systematic manipulation of these sources created a situation where French military planners were making tactical decisions based on fundamentally flawed assessments of enemy capabilities and intention. The broader implications of Bison's capture and the subsequent deception extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation around Dien Bien Phu. American intelligence officers, monitoring French operations through liaison arrangements that had been established to support Western cooperation in Southeast Asia, recognized that the techniques being employed represented a level of sophistication that indicated extensive Chinese involvement in Viet Minh intelligence. The analysis of these techniques provided insights into communist capability that would influence American intelligence operations throughout the subsequent decades of Cold War competition. The psychological impact of the compromised intelligence on French military morale represented an aspect of the operation that had been carefully calculated by Chinese planners who understood the importance of psychological factors in determining military effectiveness. The systematic degradation of tactical intelligence created a situation where French commanders could not rely on the information necessary to make effective operational decisions. The uncertainty generated by unreliable intelligence had effects that extended far beyond specific tactical errors, creating a general atmosphere of doubt and confusion that undermined the confidence necessary for effective military leadership under combat conditions. March 15th marked the beginning of the final phase of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, with the systematic Viet Minh assault on French defensive positions that had been prepared through months of careful planning and resource accumulation. The tactical intelligence provided through the compromised radio network had enabled communist forces to develop detailed understanding of French defensive preparations, artillery positions, and command arrangements that proved crucial to the success of their operations. The information, combined with conventional reconnaissance and the intelligence capabilities provided by local population support, had given Viet Minh commanders advantages that offset French superiority in equipment and firepower. The final French attempt to locate and rescue Bison took place on March 18th, when a patrol of Foreign Legion paratroopers was dispatched to investigate the last known location of his radio transmission. The patrol, moving through terrain that had been thoroughly reconnoitered by enemy forces, encountered prepared positions that indicated extensive intelligence preparation of the battle. The firefight that resulted in the patrol's withdrawal demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Viet Minh forces had achieved through Chinese training and the integration of captured intelligence about French operational methods. The patrol's report, transmitted through communication networks that had themselves been compromised through the capture of GCMA personnel and equipment, provided final confirmation that Western intelligence operations in the area had been systematically eliminated through enemy counterintelligence activity. The report described evidence of professional military engineering that indicated extensive Chinese involvement in Viet Minh operations, but the information arrived too late to influence French tactical planning for the defense of Dien Bien Phu. The intelligence failure represented by the compromise of the GCMA network had created information gaps that could not be filled through conventional reconnaissance methods. The fall of Dien Bien Phu on May 7, 1954, marked the end of French colonial control in Indochina and the beginning of American involvement in Vietnamese affairs that would continue for more than 2 decades. The intelligence lessons learned through operations like Bison's Mission provided foundational experience for the development of American unconventional warfare capabilities that would be employed throughout Southeast Asia during the subsequent conflict. The techniques developed through GCMA operations, the integration of indigenous forces with advanced communication technology, the coordination of intelligence collection with tactical air operations, the use of radio communications to direct precision strikes against targets identified through human intelligence, became standard procedures for American Special Operations Forces throughout the Cold War period. The fate of individual operators like Bison became part of the institutional memory of American intelligence services that influenced subsequent operations throughout the region. The systematic compromise of Western intelligence networks demonstrated the sophistication of communist counterintelligence capability and the importance of operational security procedures that could protect personnel and communications from systematic enemy exploitation. The analysis of these operations provided insights into enemy capabilities that influenced the development of communication security procedures and operational methods designed to reduce vulnerability to the kind of systematic intelligence penetration that had contributed to French defeat. The broader strategic implications of the intelligence war surrounding Dien Bien Phu extended far beyond the immediate tactical consequences of individual operations. The demonstration that communist forces could systematically identify and eliminate Western intelligence networks had implications for the conduct of unconventional warfare throughout the Cold War period. The techniques employed, radio direction finding, systematic analysis of communication patterns, the use of captured personnel and equipment for deception operations, represented capabilities that would be encountered by American forces throughout subsequent conflicts in Southeast Asia. The human cost of operations like Bison's mission reflected the broader moral ambiguity that characterized intelligence operations during the Cold War period. The integration of American personnel with indigenous forces created situations where individual operators became deeply involved in local conflicts that reflected complex historical and cultural factors, extending far beyond the immediate strategic objectives that had prompted American involvement. The psychological burden carried by personnel who operated in these ambiguous circumstances represented one of the hidden costs of unconventional warfare that would continue to affect American military operations throughout subsequent decades. The technical lessons learned through GCMA operations influenced the development of communication systems and operational procedures that would be employed by American Special Operations Forces throughout the Cold War period. The vulnerability of radio communications to enemy intercept and direction finding led to the development of burst transmission technique, frequency hopping system, and encryption procedures designed to reduce the vulnerability of battlefield communications to systematic enemy exploitation. The integration of tactical air operations with ground-based intelligence collection became a standard feature of American unconventional warfare doctrine, refined through years of operational experience in Southeast Asia. The cultural and linguistic capabilities that operators like Bison brought to their missions represented advantages that could not be easily replicated through conventional military training programs. The deep understanding of local conditions, customs, and languages that enabled effective cooperation with indigenous forces required years of experience and cultural immersion that was difficult to achieve through formal military education. The loss of such personnel represented a reduction in capabilities that could not be quickly replaced, creating institutional vulnerabilities that affected American intelligence operations throughout the region. Today, the mountains surrounding Dien Bien Phu remain largely unchanged from their appearance during the climactic battle that ended French colonial rule in Indochina. The limestone caves that provided concealment for observation posts like Bison's continue to dot the landscape, silent testimony to the intelligence war that preceded and shaped the conventional military operations that captured historical. Local farmers occasionally discover pieces of military equipment buried in the red clay soil, fragments of radio antennas, corroded battery cases, pieces of camouflage material that once concealed the positions from which Western intelligence operators observed enemy preparations for the battle that would reshape the political geography of Southeast Asia. The technical innovations pioneered during operations like the GCMA missions established precedents for the integration of advanced communication technology with human intelligence collection that would become standard practice for American Special Operations Forces throughout subsequent decades. The techniques developed for coordinating tactical air operations with ground-based intelligence collection, the procedures for establishing and maintaining clandestine radio communications in hostile territory, and the methods for integrating indigenous personnel with advanced military technology became foundational elements of American unconventional warfare doctrine that influenced operations from Central America to Afghanistan. The strategic deception operations that followed Bison's capture demonstrated the vulnerability of intelligence networks to systematic enemy exploitation and the importance of operational security procedures designed to limit the consequences of personnel and equipment compromise. The systematic transmission of false intelligence through compromised communication channels represented a level of sophistication in deception operations that influenced the development of communication security procedures and verification methods designed to detect and counter such operations. The lessons learned through these operations became part of the institutional knowledge that shaped American intelligence operations throughout the Cold War period. The individual sacrifice represented by operators like Bison reflected the broader human cost of intelligence operations that operated in the gray areas between conventional military actions and diplomatic negotiations. The moral ambiguity inherent in operations that involved American personnel in local conflicts with complex historical and cultural dimensions created psychological burdens that extended far beyond immediate operational requirements. The long-term consequences of such operations, both for the individuals involved and for the American military institutions that employed them, represented hidden costs of Cold War competition that continued to influence American foreign policy throughout subsequent decades. The institutional memory preserved in American intelligence services regarding operations like Bison's mission influenced the development of training programs, operational procedures, and support systems designed to reduce the vulnerability of personnel operating in similar circumstances. The analysis of communication security failures, the development of extraction procedures for personnel in compromised positions, and the creation of support systems for operators working with indigenous forces became standard elements of American Special Operations doctrine that reflected lessons learned through the painful experience of intelligence operations during the First Indochina War. The broader historical significance of intelligence operations like the GCMA missions extended beyond their immediate tactical contributions to the conflicts in which they were employed. The development of techniques for coordinating unconventional warfare operations with conventional military forces, the integration of advanced technology with traditional intelligence collection methods, and the systematic exploitation of cultural and linguistic capabilities represented innovations in military doctrine that influenced American strategic thinking throughout the Cold War period. The precedents established through these operations shaped American approaches to conflicts in Central America, the Middle East, and Central Asia that continued into the 21st century. In the archives of American intelligence agencies, the file marked Bison remains classified more than 70 years after his disappearance in the mountains of northern. The operational details of his mission, the techniques employed for his capture and interrogation, and the consequences of the intelligence compromise that followed his disappearance continue to provide lessons for contemporary intelligence operations. The preservation of such institutional memory reflects the recognition that the human and technical innovations pioneered during the First Indochina War established precedents that continue to influence American strategic thinking about unconventional warfare and intelligence operations in complex cultural environments. The silence that followed Bison's final transmission echoes across decades of American involvement in Southeast Asian conflict, a reminder that the most consequential battles of the modern era are often fought in the invisible realm of communications intercepts, code-breaking, and psychological operations. His story represents the beginning of American engagement with the kind of warfare that would define the Cold War period. Conflicts fought not only with conventional weapons, but with information, deception, and the systematic exploitation of technological and cultural advantages. The mountains of northern Vietnam, where his voice disappeared into the static of compromised radio frequencies, became the laboratory where techniques were developed that would shape American military operations for generations to come. History is not made of victory, it's made of voices that refused to disappear. What should we cover next? Subscribe and share your thoughts on this video. Your feedback and support are immensely valuable and help me keep improving the content.